Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars video. Today's video will be of the rambling variety, and for those who are new to the channel or don't otherwise know, aside from my more structured lore or discussion videos, sometimes I also just ramble on a topic. Usually I'll make these because there's something recent that I want to talk about, and it doesn't really work as well in a scripted format, and frequently there won't be as much footage or content to show, so these videos work really well in the background if you're playing a game or going to work or doing whatever else. Anyway, one thing I will note is that if you do want a more structured video, over on my second channel, X2, I covered some advanced fleet tactics for Empire at War in a really cool video. Basically how you can take down a much larger fleet with a small force. I'll link to that in the upper right hand corner and also down in the comments. So, there's one planet more than any other in the sequel trilogy that has been noticeably absent. That, of course, is Coruscant, seat of the government in the original trilogy and prequel eras, and home of the New Republic in Star Wars Legends. However, the New Republic in Star Wars canon has had a roaming capital, which is actually a pretty cool idea. Basically, the capital will stay on a planet for a certain amount of years, then it will move somewhere else. I've got no problem with that. It might not be very practical, but it's an interesting idea, and that's why the Hosnian system was destroyed in The Force Awakens. That's just where the capital happened to be at that point. So okay, I guess it makes sense why the New Republic wasn't on Coruscant, but still it's been set up, especially by the prequel trilogy, to arguably be the most important planet in the galaxy. Not only is it at the complete center of things, but it's where the old Jedi Temple was. It's where Palpatine rose to power. Practically, it's the center of galactic culture and civilization. And you know what's happened to Coruscant after the Battle of Endor in canon? Well, basically nothing. It's not featured once in the sequel trilogy, as we mentioned, but more than that, it's been almost completely missing from every Star Wars book, comic, or video game set in that era. It just makes no sense. This is basically the capital of the galaxy, regardless of what the New Republic chooses to do. And the only real memory of Coruscant I have in a post-Endor new canon book would be from the Aftermath Trilogy. If I remember correctly, in those books we do get to see some of the rioting from Return of the Jedi, and Admiral Ray Sloane goes to Coruscant to look up details about the Imperial fleet. I think Masameda is also there when he signs the Galactic Concordance or whatever, but even in that book, Coruscant is not treated like an important planet. The New Republic doesn't seem to have any interest in it. It's sort of just there, not doing anything. And you might not believe me, you might think that I'm missing a book or exaggerating Coruscant's absence in the new canon. And it is true that there may have been some other mentions of Coruscant, it might have been named, but even if you look at the Wikipedia page for Coruscant, the post-galactic Civil War portion of the page is literally a paragraph and a sentence. Apparently, the Rise of Skywalker Jr. novel mentions that Coruscant was an open rebellion against the First Order, for whatever that's worth. So why did this happen? Why has Coruscant been completely missing from all Star Wars works? Well, we do know that Coruscant was planned at one point for Episode 9. A revolt on Coruscant and a battle over Coruscant, including a journey into the Jedi Temple, would have played a major part of Colin Trevorrow's Episode 9, and there's a ton of concept art which shows that. Colin Trevorrow was actually much more willing to dig into the EU and the prequels than JJ seems to have been, and to me, this is one of the reasons why Coruscant didn't appear in the sequel trilogy. This may be jaded, but my thinking is that Coruscant is a very prequel planet. It lacks this sort of dirty nature and lived-in style of the original trilogy. It's of course heavily associated with the prequels, and JJ, when making Episode 7 especially, almost completely avoided the prequels, maybe because he personally didn't like them, maybe because of the backlash they received in their heyday, who knows? But my guess is that he more closely wanted to follow the original trilogy storyline while also avoiding invoking ideas or concepts of the prequels, which in my opinion is a pretty boring play. As we talked about yesterday, in my opinion, Coruscant is one of the most interesting and awe-inspiring planets in the galaxy. I mean, we have deserts and swamps and whatever else on Earth. We don't, however, have skyscrapers that are multiple kilometers high or a planet-stretching city. We don't have flying cars or all of the cool things that Coruscant is well known for. That, however, is just a guess, and only really explains Episode 7. What we do know, however, is that Pablo Hidalgo of the Lucasfilm Story Group said that Coruscant hasn't been featured, at all, in expanded universe materials because it was meant to star in Episode 9. Now, Pablo has since privated his Twitter, so I can't show you, but basically they're saying they wanted to leave Coruscant completely open to be shown in that movie without, having to contradict itself. So there are a few things I think about this. For one, why does Coruscant's inclusion in Episode 9 mean that it can't be touched for the prior 30 years or so? I mean, even in Trevorrow's version for Episode 9, which was called Duel of the Fates, Coruscant was basically just occupied by the First Order. And I mean, that kind of makes sense. That's what you'd expect to happen. You can write tons of stories in the city that will either be self-contained or which won't get in the way of a First Order invasion, and I don't see how you could contradict that anyway unless you specifically write that the First Order was not invaded throughout the entire war, which you just wouldn't do because you wouldn't write about a conflict that's ongoing in the movies, or you wouldn't write about the entirety of the conflict at least. To be honest, I really think that only partially explains what's going on. I think the new Star Wars Expanded Universe has went a little too far in trying to define its own identity. We don't see the New Republic established on Coruscant, because that's what the New Republic did in Star Wars Legends. We don't see Jedi on Coruscant, and just generally, we don't even very often see familiar planets. And that's fine, but it's just like aliens in the new Star Wars movies. They need to find a good balance between creating new things and making interesting new aliens and planets, and also using things that already exist to help ground the experience in the universe that we all love. That's another reason, but I think perhaps the biggest one of all is that the Star Wars Expanded Universe just hasn't been telling very large, cohesive stories yet. Now, I kind of understand why they did this because the trilogy was happening, but most stories have been relatively self-contained, with I guess the exception of Star Wars Aftermath, and have told stories about individuals rather than about how the government is changing and how the galaxy is progressing. If you're a Legends fan, this would be more of how the Bantam era of Star Wars books operated, where each story was almost self-contained. However, even in those, you saw characters kept over between novels. You did see slight progressions in the government. For example, Leia was elected Chief of State, Luke established his Jedi Praxium, etc. Whereas the Del Rey books, which saw the Yuuzhan Vong invasion and Legacy of the Force and Fate of the Jedi, told a much more interconnected story. So right now, the Star Wars Expanded Universe in canon has been more of the former, and I think that's part of the reason why we haven't seen how these major planets have handled the post-Empire galaxy, just because it hasn't been important. A good example of this would be the first Alphabet Squadron book. Now, I thought that book was okay, it wasn't my favorite, but it was focused almost totally on the small squadron of starfighters hunting down a single Imperial fighter group. Now, that's fine on its own, but when you're really not getting those other stories to fill in the grander picture, especially in this era where so much time is missing, I think that this kind of small-scale storytelling becomes really obvious. Even in the Rogue Squadron and X-Wing books, which, of course, Alphabet Squadron takes some inspiration from, you got a mix of small-scale squadron action and galactic developments. We see the New Republic, for example, plan the taking of Coruscant and hunting major warlords. And I guess that's just because the squadron has a much more important role, and I think that would have been a much better way to handle the Alphabet Squadron books. Part of the explanation is that they're cast-offs, but that's true too of Wraith Squadron, and they spend most of their time hunting down the galaxy's most powerful warlord. So there's been a lack of context for things that have happened, and that's why we haven't seen Coruscant in the expanded universe, as well as the issues we talked about, including how Coruscant was supposed to appear in Episode 9, how they may have been saving storytelling for that era, how there's probably a lack of real work between the story group and filmmakers, and there's more. But one last thing I want to mention is that Coruscant was, at least at one point, planned to appear in even JJ's version of Episode 9. Why didn't it appear? Well, we don't know. Kylo Ren would have went there, maybe to the Jedi Temple. It's hard to say, and maybe this is because JJ didn't like the idea, but I think we've seen now that one of the major issues with Episode 9 is that there just wasn't enough time. They needed another year at least to work on the movie. All in all, all, I just think it's a shame, and I really hope that the post-episode 9 lore, when it eventually comes, does focus on Coruscant again, and my hope for that era, generally, is that we get what we didn't get after Endor. I'm not saying I want a Thrawn trilogy, but I'd like them to throw us Expanded Universe fans a bone. I don't mean Legends Expanded Universe fans, I just mean people that read the books. I want them to tell us a meaningful story, planned out in advance, with characters that carry over between different novels and mediums, and I just want an excuse to read the books. But that's all I've got for today, guys. Hope you enjoyed this rambling video. Until next time, have a great one, and may the Force be with you.